Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Friday. This is Seattle Now. This week, we got all the weather. We heard a few theories on what makes you a real Seattleite, plus the Space Needle is turning 60. We're breaking down the week with Salon.com TV critic Melanie McFarland and The Stranger's Jas Keimig. But first, let's get you caught up. Light rail riders were forced to take shuttle buses for several hours yesterday after a system failure closed 3 stations. Passengers at the U District, Roosevelt, and Northgate stations were rerouted after a failure in the fire safety system. Sound Transit used Twitter to alert riders, but man, a lot of them were frustrated. Service resumed just before 5 p.m., but they're still trying to figure out what went wrong. COVID cases and hospitalizations are ticking up again in King County. Cases rose about 40% in the last week. Hospitalizations, 9%. We are still far below the numbers we saw during the Delta and Omicron surges, so public health says no need to worry for now. Some cities are reinstating mask mandates because of similar upticks. No sign yet that Seattle will join them. Who's out to cancel Washington's congressional candidate Lauren Culp? Turns out, not Facebook. Last week, Culp tweeted that Facebook was trying to ban his account. The account is still up, and Facebook told the Seattle Times, no way. They didn't send the notice and have no such plans. Looks as if Culp may have been the victim of a common phishing scam. Culp is running to unseat Republican Dan Newhouse in Washington's 4th congressional district. We made it to Friday again, and boy, did we earn this one. We endured hail, snow, record cold temperatures, and, most importantly, Alaska air flight cancellations. Jas Keimig is here. They're a staff writer for The Stranger covering art. Jas, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Great. So glad you're here. Melanie McFarland is here, too, TV critic for Salon.com. Welcome back, Melanie.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Dramatic weather this week all around the Sound. True confession, I actually saw none of it in my neighborhood. Nothing changed here at all, except it got really cold. But the National Weather Service sends up this little up ahead every week. And last week it looked like a no bad idea brainstorm, like cold, hail, snow, thunder, rain. I thought, whoa, man, tuck in and get some wood. But everybody around me seemed to be experiencing a different storm. What was it like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I live in Capitol Hill and it's sunny right now, but I think 30 minutes ago it was hailing. On Saturday, I had a friend come over and I was almost like, don't come because it was hailing so hard. I grew up here and I've never experienced something like this in April, and it's so dramatic, It
was.
Yeah, it's not how I would think I would welcome spring this time around.
Yeah, I saw it all on Twitter for sure. Melanie, you're in West Seattle. What did you have?
I was actually on the phone with a friend from Tacoma, and she said, oh, it's snowing here, and it was completely sunny. And I was like, stinks to be you. I didn't say that to her, but I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then probably about 45 minutes later, sure enough, there were flurries coming down. I grew up in Chicago, and if there are any Chicagoans listening, they may be nodding to this. I remember going into, waking up in the morning and, going into, school or whatever when it was 60 degrees and then coming out and it would be 30. So to me, I'm just like, oh, okay. It doesn't bother me so much. I just kind of find it one of the amazing parts of living here. This is the first region of every region has a microclimate, but here you really experience the microclimate. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I feel like as long as it's light outside, I'm okay. We endured this winter and it was super dark, and now it's 7 p.m. and I can still see my hand outside, so I'll take that.
Yeah. Those big, beautiful spring flakes, though, in Kent and Federal Way and down in Tacoma, they look like, big paper towels coming down. They're so pretty and light. Freezing, though. Really, really cold this week. In fact, it was historically cold. It hasn't been this chilly overnight for 37 years. And I think I probably killed the maidenhair fern I just moved outside.
Oh, no.
Being indoors for the winter. So I don't know. I feel like the spring plantings are at risk.
Yeah. It's also bizarre because, we had the big cherry blossom bloom just a couple weeks ago now, right? And that's usually for me my sign that, things are out, spring is springing, but I'm sorry to hear about your fern, rest in peace.
It hates me.
Yeah.
It hates me. Maidenhairs are just the most temperamental ferns. Just beautiful, terrible.
They are, yeah. I'm a gardener too, and I have held off I usually plant things pretty late, thinking about all of this craziness that can go on with the weather. I realize that I'm sitting inside and it's like, oh, it's cozy outside, and there's all these big fleeks coming down. And I realize that people who are driving out in this, people who have to be like out delivering packages or are outside in general and don't have that whole like cozy appeal, that's the part that I really feel for. Because we get to look at this from a position of warmth, and so that's the part that I get reminded of, where it can be a relief, and then all of a sudden we have these freezing temperatures. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Super important perspective when you're counting on the weather changing because your life situation is difficult. For sure. Which is an important point because a recent survey of 700 voters for the Seattle Metro Chamber of Commerce revealed 67% of people here have considered moving out of the city. And the top reasons will sound familiar to you: affordability and public safety.
I understand. I completely understand that. It's funny. Again, I don't want to keep on bringing up like I'm from a different city, but I think that these are things that a lot of cities across the nation are facing. I feel like Seattle, and I've lived here since the late 90s. It's part of the growing pains of an expanding city. We have a footprint that is expanding. It's also getting more dense. And we're also dealing with, a huge change in the economy, both locally and nationally, fighting recession. So I think these are the things that are signs of a city that is really kind of booming. And I can understand wanting to move out in terms of the affordability. I've said many times, I feel very fortunate that I'm in a situation where my housing is stable. I've had friends who wanted to move here and they could not afford to live here. So I do understand that. What I hope is that people will at least be a little bit more just conscious of the fact that in order to live in a city, these are things that people in other big cities have contended with for a very long time because it has, these are things that have been in place for a long time. We're living on top of each other. There's, a resource allocation issue just in terms of housing, but also in terms of livability, wages, those things. So I don't think that Seattle, if people need to leave because they can't afford it, I completely get it. That's the part that's really sad. I am very hesitant when it comes to the NIMBY element of this, just in terms of not understanding that there are people out there who are suffering. I know that we have a homelessness crisis, but also just in terms of, building housing in our area that can be affordable. There's a lot of reaction to that I'm watching very curiously. Let's just put it that way.
Well, and to just say that 67% of the city say they've considered leaving, or 67% of these survey respondents say they've considered leaving, ignores the complexity of what's at play here, what it means for people to not be able to afford to live here or feel unsafe, and how these things factor into the third reason cited by people, which is homelessness, right? All of these things feed in.
Totally. And I think, Seattle has always been a really difficult place to find cheap housing, and that was before the pandemic even happened. And so now, we're dealing with 8.5% inflation, so not only is housing getting more expensive, but, I spent $70 on groceries yesterday and I never do. And so I think it's certainly understandable and valid that, folks are thinking about, for what I'm paying in rent here, I could be paying a mortgage in Minnesota, and have more space. So I think it's definitely important for us to kind of focus on making sure that, there's access to affordable housing, that everyone gets housed. And I think, that's kind of the root of a lot of these issues that people are, getting really upset or getting really frustrated in the city about.
Yeah. And you can't help but draw the comparison to other states because it is very difficult to live here now. I've been here for 22 years and I've witnessed a lot of change, and it just keeps getting harder to be someone here who doesn't have a lot of money, for sure.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, the creative community, too, right? In a city where the middle class is considered $100,000, right? You make $100,000 a year. It really decimates a lot of artistic communities because, you don't make a lot of money as an artist, right? You need rent to be cheap so that you can dedicate more funds to paint supplies or a studio space to practice dancing or, camera equipment. So I think that, with this rise of the this lowering of quality of life, higher costs of living, it certainly has cultural impacts as well.
Yeah. One of the saddest stories of the city for me was when my son's keyboard teacher, who he loved, had to move out of the city, right? Because he could not afford to live here anymore. And it really made me wonder, what happens to that funky artist class when you can't afford to stay anymore. And, and maybe we should take a survey and ask people what they value about living here and start there.
I think that would be really helpful. Yeah.
Well, this really gets at a bigger question here, also being addressed in the Seattle Times this week. We need to ponder the traits of the Pacific Northwesterner. A poll of more than 800 Seattle and Portland area residents sussed this out. And no surprises here, of course. Rain doesn't faze us. We like to dress really casually, and the Seattle freeze is alive and well. Do either of you consider yourselves true Pacific Northwesterners?
I would say yes. I moved here from, Missouri when I was 6. So I spent most of my childhood and young adult life here. And I live here now, obviously. But I always feel like it takes you leaving somewhere to be able to really see the qualities of being a Seattleite or a Pacific Northwesterner. And I went to college on the East Coast, and immediately 3 things popped out at me as being really weird. One, I hated getting dressed up to go out. I was just like, why can't I wear my jeans and my Vans? Why is that not appropriate? You not using an umbrella, and not having any adequate cold weather clothes at all. And I was like, okay, that feels, this type of thing feels very PNW to me. And so, yes, I would consider myself a Pacific Northwesterner.
Now, Melanie, you're a Chicago transplant, but I don't know. It only takes a few years, according to Mossback, to become a true Pacific Northwesterner.
And I have eaten gooey duck. I think that's it's like getting the Pacific Northwest communion, where it's like, oh, dear, gooey duck. But I will say this, and I don't know if this is unique to Chicagoans. I see this with people who are from other cities. I have lived in the Pacific Northwest now officially longer than I lived in Chicago. However, I was born and raised in Chicago, so I'll still get into pizza arguments and nitpick over Chicago-style pizza and things like that. So this is my home. Whenever I go home to look at that. Whenever I go back to Chicago, there are things that I miss about it, but I'm always happy to know that I'm back home in the Pacific Northwest. Just in terms of being able to breathe fresh air and looking and what was touching on oh, look at the greenery and things like that. There's a reason I live here, but I think that I don't know if I would say, hey, I'm a official Pacific Northwest person and people knew my history and they're in the room, they'd probably take issue with that. So I live here. I love it. I'm a Seattleite. But I don't know that I can necessarily accurately embrace that definition. Does that make sense?
Same.
Oh, yeah, totally.
This place suits me, but I don't actually consider myself a true Pacific Northwesterner because I was born and raised in Jersey. And that lives very thoroughly inside of me here, even though I love the rain, never use a raincoat, and prefer jeans. The things that vex me about the East Coast get solved on the West Coast. Yeah. But it's interesting, Jas, because there's so many newcomers here. We all agree this is a city of transplants at this point, for the most part. I wonder if it is the Pacific Northwest traits that draw them here, or whether we're shifting the traits that make this Pacific Northwest element.
Yeah, I think I think there's always room for shifting. I think it's always fun to talk about these traits that make a Pacific Northwesterner, but I think ultimately I'm always down to like make that identity more fluid, you know, because I think often a lot of the traits that we associate with Seattleites may not be super representative of, you know, the queer community or, you know, Black, Indigenous, you know, other of color communities, right? So I think it's kind of good to have these things that we can kind of joke about. But when I really think about what it means to live here and call this place my home, I always feel like I end up focusing more on, you know, the environment or the weather or things like that. So yeah, always open to changing. New things happen, sure. You know?
One last thing before we go. Another Seattle icon is celebrating its birthday. The Space Needle turns 60 on April 17th. Lots of celebrations. They're even going to paint it Galaxy Gold, the original color from 1962. That was for the World's Fair. And here's from the Seattle Times. This is another unique Pacific Northwest, or I'll just say a Seattle thing. You can help paint it if you share a memory of the Space Needle in 200 words or less. They're going to choose 5 people from the stories to paint. I feel like this is going to be a very self-selecting group of storytellers, honestly.
I have a fence that isn't even painted, and we've been meaning to do it for like 7 years. Yeah. Why? Well, it's like, hey, free labor. No.
Is this a prize? It doesn't feel like a prize.
Come on,
it feels like a liability.
It's cool, right? Like, you're on top of, like, the tall, like... maybe it speaks to some sort of like human impulse to like want to stand on like the tallest thing, you know? And I think it'd be kind of sick to, you know, you have to paint obviously, but just to be able to get a nice panorama, right, of the region that we live in, this home that we nestle ourselves in. There could be some beauty to it, but I'm not afraid of heights, so.
Oh, from the Afraid of Heights department, no. I am not Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible. No.
We're leaving it there. Thanks to our guests, Jas Keimig, their staff writer at The Stranger, covering visual art and music, and Melanie McFarland, TV critic for Salon.com. It was real fun. Thanks, you two.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you listening. We want to say thanks today to Albert listening in Renton, Ben in Seattle, and Andy in South Lake Union. They supported the show by making a donation. You can too. If you want to contribute and hear your own name in our credits, check out the link in the show notes. Caroline Chamberlain Gomez produced today's show with help from Clare McGrane. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. Talk to you Monday. Have a great weekend.